Hi, my loves. How are you? In today's video, I'm going to tell a story that drives me crazy, just remembering it. It was with my uncle, and it happened when I was 18 years old. Stay until the end to see what happened. So, let's get started. I never imagined that my life could change so much in such a short time. If someone told me what I'm about to reveal, I would have laughed and called them crazy. But sometimes reality surprises us in ways we can't even explain. It all started on a Friday night, after a long and tiring day at college. My only desire was to relax on the couch and forget about the world for a few hours. However, what I found when I opened the kitchen door changed everything. There was my uncle sitting at the table. It wasn't strange to see him since he used to visit us often. But that night, he was not alone. Opposite him sat an impressive woman, as if she had stepped straight off a magazine cover. Her long, wavy hair framed a perfect face, and her eyes had a mesmerizing sparkle. I froze in the doorway, not knowing what to think. My mother was in the living room watching her favorite soap opera and seemed completely oblivious to what was happening in the kitchen. My uncle looked up and smiled casually. "You're early, Natasha," he said, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. I just nodded, unable to respond. The woman looked at me and smiled warmly. It was at that moment that I noticed something strange. The way she looked at my uncle was not normal. There was something else in that expression, a mixture of admiration and devotion that gave me goosebumps. Something was happening there, but I couldn't figure out what. "Hello?" I finally managed to say, leaving my books on the table. "This is a friend," my uncle explained casually. The woman reached out her hand to me. "Nice to meet you," she said, her voice as soft as her appearance. I shook his hand, feeling completely out of place. A simple "same" came out of my mouth before I walked away, but my curiosity had already been piqued. I pretended to be busy with my cell phone, but in reality, I continued to watch the two of them. They spoke naturally, but there was something about that woman's body language that bothered me. She looked at my uncle as if he were the center of the universe. Finally, the woman stood up and elegantly adjusted her coat before leaving. Before leaving, she looked me straight in the eye and said something that would echo in my mind for days. "He is not what he appears to be." These words hung in the air. My uncle, on the other hand, continued to act as if nothing had happened. He collected the coffee cups and began to calmly wash them. I couldn't hold back. "What did she mean by that?" I asked. My uncle smiled and shrugged. "People see what they want to see, Natasha." Just that. The answer didn't satisfy me, but I realized that insisting wouldn't get me anywhere. That night, I could barely sleep. That woman's words resonated in my mind, mixed with my uncle's irritating tranquility. Something was wrong, and I knew I wouldn't rest until I found out what it was. Over the next few days, I tried to ignore the issue and focus on my studies, but it was useless. The scene from that night kept coming back to me, like an unsolved puzzle. The more I thought, the more convinced I became that I needed to find answers. My opportunity came a few days later, when my mother asked me to return a book she had borrowed from my uncle. It was the perfect excuse to go to his house and try to better understand what was happening. When I got there, he was in the kitchen making coffee. He smiled with that irritating tranquility as soon as he saw me. "Thank you for bringing the book," he said, taking the aged volume from my hands. "You're welcome," I replied, trying to sound casual as I set my backpack on a chair. I looked around the kitchen, looking for any clues. On the table, there was an open notebook, and although I was only able to read a few words, something about them caught my attention. It's all about connections, not appearances. Before I could read any further, he calmly closed the notebook. "Anything else?" he asked, still smiling. "I was just thinking about what your friend said the other day," I ventured. He raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "And what did she say?" that you are not what you seem to be. My uncle leaned across the table and watched me for a moment, as if deciding what he should or shouldn't tell me. Sometimes people see what they want to see, Natasha, and that's all that matters. But that doesn't explain anything, I protested. He just shrugged. Maybe you need to see for yourself. These words left me even more intrigued. I left his house with more questions than answers, and with the feeling that I was getting involved in something much bigger than I imagined. Over the next few days, my mind remained stuck on that conversation. The phrase, "people see what they want to see," rang around in my head, but I couldn't understand what he really meant. I decided I needed to go back there, if only to take a closer look. A few days later, my mother asked me to bring him a cake. It was the perfect excuse for a new visit. When I arrived, he was in the garden, pruning some plants. His tranquility bothered me even more. "Hello, Natasha," he said, drying his hands. "What brings you here today?" "My mom sent this cake," I said, trying to sound casual. He smiled and invited me in. Once again, the kitchen was spotless, but something caught my eye. There was an open book on the table. I pretended not to notice, but I couldn't take my eyes off him. It looked like a diary, full of strange notes and symbols. "You look different today," he commented, placing the cake on the table. "Is something bothering you?" "Just curious, I guess," I replied. "About what?" "About what your friend meant that day?" He stopped for a moment and looked directly at me. "Natasha, the world is not as simple as it seems. There are things we can only understand when we are ready." "Ready for what?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. "To see what's really around us," he replied. This answer only made me more confused. Before I could insist, he changed the subject, but I realized he was hiding something. That's when I decided to investigate on my own. I came home that night and couldn't stop thinking about the diary on the table. Why did he have so many mysterious notes? I knew I needed to find out more. So I made a plan to go back the next day and try to look at that notebook more carefully. The next morning, I went to his house again. He seemed surprised to see me so early, but received me as calmly as always. "You're becoming a frequent visitor," he joked. This time I had a goal. As he went out to get something from the yard, I prepared to act. I took the opportunity and opened the diary. The pages were full of diagrams, symbols, and disjointed phrases. Everything is connected. Time is not linear. Observe the signs, they reveal the truth. My heart raced. Before I could read any further, I heard his footsteps approaching and quickly closed the book. "What are you doing?" he asked, looking at me with a slight smile. "Nothing. Just waiting for you to come back." I lied. He didn't seem to believe it, but he didn't press either. Instead, he sat at the table and was silent for a moment. "Natasha, do you really want to understand what is happening?" I swallowed hard. "I want." He nodded slowly. "Then you need to open your mind. Not everything can be explained with words. Some things need to be felt." I didn't know what he meant by that, but the intensity in his voice intrigued me. He got up, went to the bookshelf, and took out an old book, placing it in front of me. "Start here," he said. The book was old, with a worn cover and no title. When I opened it, I saw pages full of symbols and text in a language I didn't recognize. "What is that?" I asked. "A gateway." That answer left me even more confused, but at the same time I felt a shiver of excitement. My uncle was inviting me into a world I never imagined existed, and I knew I couldn't back away now. As I drove home, my head was spinning with questions. What did that book mean? What was he trying to show me? Why had that woman said he wasn't what he seemed? I knew I was just beginning to unravel a much bigger mystery. In the following days, the book my uncle gave me never left my mind. I spent hours trying to decipher its symbols and disjointed phrases. Some pages looked like diagrams, while others contained cryptic messages, such as, "Time is a mirror," or "The truth is in the shadows." The more I read, the more I felt drawn to that mystery. I returned to his house the following Saturday, determined to get answers. He was in the garden, as always, looking far too relaxed for someone who was hiding such big secrets. "Are you ready to continue?" he asked as soon as he saw me. "Yes," I said, trying to sound confident. He took me inside and closed the door carefully. This time, the atmosphere seemed different, more charged. On the table, there were lit candles and an open notebook with new notes. "Why all this?" I asked, pointing to the table. "Because you're about to see something that will change the way you think forever." My heart raced. He pulled out a chair for me to sit on and placed the notebook in front of me. "What do you see?" he asked. I looked at the symbols and lines that connected words I couldn't yet understand. "It looks like a map," I ventured. He smiled. "And it is, but it's not a physical map. It is a guide to understanding the invisible connections that shape our reality." I didn't know whether to laugh or run away. Everything seemed surreal. "Invisible connections?" I asked. "You mean energy?" "Something like that," he replied. "But it's not just energy. It's the way emotions, thoughts and intentions create bonds that go beyond what we can see." "And why are you showing me this?" I asked, feeling panic beginning to emerge. "Because you're different, Natasha. You feel these connections without even realizing it." I was silent. Part of me wanted to run, but another part was too fascinated to stop. He took out the old book he had given me earlier and opened it to a marked page. "Here, read this." I read aloud. "Those who see beyond appearances can shape reality, but only if they are willing to pay the price." "What price?" I asked, scared. He looked me straight in the eyes and replied, "The truth." That answer didn't make sense at the time, but something inside me knew he was serious. Before I could ask further, he got up and blew out the candles. "That's enough for today," he said. I left his house feeling like my life was about to change, but I still didn't know how. That night, I couldn't sleep. His words kept echoing in my mind. I needed to understand what was happening, but I was also afraid of what I would discover. The next morning, I decided to go back. When I arrived, the door was ajar. I entered without knocking and found him in the living room, talking on the phone. As soon as he saw me, he quickly hung up. "You came early," he said with a slight smile. "This time, we need to talk," I said bluntly. He nodded and pointed to the couch. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," I replied. He took a deep breath and, for the first time, seemed to hesitate. "Natasha, some truths are difficult to accept. Are you sure you want to continue absent?" "I want." He leaned forward and said, "Everything you've seen so far, the symbols, the books, the words, are just the surface. There are forces that most people ignore, but they are always present. And these forces can be used for good or evil." My stomach turned. "And you use these forces?" He was silent for a moment before responding. "Yes." I felt a shiver. "How?" He picked up the notebook and opened it to a page with circles drawn on it and arrows connecting them. "It all starts here, understanding the connections between people and how to influence them." "Influence?" I asked, suspicious. "Words, gestures, thoughts. Everything matters," he replied. That conversation made me uneasy. It felt like I was being pulled into something much bigger than I could comprehend. But at the same time, I couldn't stop. "And what happens if I learn this?" I asked. He smiled for the first time that day. "You will see the world as it really is." After that conversation, I felt there was no turning back. My uncle had only shown me the tip of the iceberg, and now I was determined to go deeper. I spent the next few days studying the book he gave me, trying to understand the connections described in the diagrams. But no matter how hard I tried, there was something that remained beyond my reach. The following Saturday, he invited me to a meeting at his home. "I want you to meet some people," he said, with a tone that made me uncomfortable. When I arrived, the room was lit by candles, and there were 5 people sitting around the table, 3 men and 2 women, all with calm, confident expressions. They greeted me with polite smiles, but I felt something strange about them. My uncle introduced me as his niece. "Natasha is learning about connections." Everyone nodded as if they already knew who I was. I sat down, trying to look confident, but the tension in the room was palpable. The conversation started lightly: books, music, films. But over time, the topics became more abstract. I looked at my uncle, waiting for him to say something, but he just watched silently. It was like he was testing me. "What if I don't want to go through with this?" I asked, trying to control my voice. One of the men, tall and serious-looking, answered even before my uncle. "There is no going back once you start." I was freezing. "Why not?" "Because now you know too much," he said. I looked at my uncle, expecting him to defend me, but he just nodded. "And truth. You've already crossed the line, Natasha. Now you need to decide whether you're going to move forward or live with the questions forever." I got up. "Is this a game?" The woman smiled. "The world is a game, and you're just beginning to understand the rules." I left there feeling my heart racing. When I got home, I couldn't sleep. Their words echoed in my head. Was I really stuck in that situation? And the worst part, did I want to leave? The next day, I went back to talk to my uncle. "I want answers," he said bluntly. He sighed and pointed to the chair. "All good. I'll tell you what you want to know." He explained that he was part of a group that studied the connections between people, emotions, and energy. They believed that everything in the world was linked by invisible threads, and that anyone who understood these ties could influence others. "Is this manipulation?" I asked. "No. It's understanding," he replied. "And what happens if someone abuses it?" "They pay the price," he said, with a dark look. I felt a shiver. "And what is the price?" "Losing control." At that moment, I realized that my uncle was not just someone curious about mysteries. He was part of something much bigger and potentially dangerous. "Have you lost control yet?" I asked. He hesitated before answering. "Once, and it was enough to never repeat the mistake again." I didn't want to ask anything else. I knew that, from then on, any step I took would change my life forever. The following week, I continued studying the books and attending meetings. I learned to recognize patterns and understand how people's emotions could be shaped, but at the same time, I felt like I was moving away from who I was before. My uncle noticed this, and one day he said to me, "You need to decide how far you want to go, Natasha, because after a certain point, there is no going back." I looked at him, and for the first time, I felt scared. What if I've already gone too far? He smiled, but this time there was sadness in his eyes. "Then you need to learn to control it. Because if you don't, connections will control you."